Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here among so many impressive people at TEDxOxbridge and its very witty theme of Bridge of Whys. I thought I'd reverse that wording and start with the question, why bridges? It's a perfectly useful metaphor, but why? What does it mean? How does it work? What is it a metaphor of? I think that the best way to approach this is by thinking about something that's in common to all of us, Oxford and Cambridge. Universities have, since their beginning, been a place for educating leaders, and also a place for bridging gaps. We bridge the gap between ignorance and knowledge, or between those capable of influencing others and those less so. So it's a good metaphor to think about the bridges in both of our universities and how that bridging act itself is connected to the idea of leadership. Oxford and Cambridge have, perhaps from the beginning, been involved, from their beginnings, been involved in this mission, which is now more relevant perhaps than ever before as we see our societies become increasingly polarized. Arguably, our leaders, both big and small, are less interested in listening to people who disagree with them, who occupy the extremes of those polarities in a normal distribution of thought and ideas. Whereas more responsible leaders think about bridging that gap rather than just shouting across from one polarity to the other. Now, of course, it's easy to maintain polarities, and I can do that right here. If you'll work with me, I can ask you a question in a certain way. I can lead you to answer in a certain way that maintains a certain polarity. Let's try it. Let's see if this works. Here's my question for you. It's a spiritual question. It's a spiritual question which you're going to eventually, oops, here we go. I'm bridging technology and chance as the results come in. Now, obviously, I set that up in a way that conditioned an answer that is useful for my purposes. But it doesn't always have to be that way. Now, we can think of Oxford and Cambridge in a state of constant rivalry or friendly rivalry. But clearly, there's much more in common between these two polarities than there is different. Anyone who knows both institutions might be hypersensitive to their distinctions, but from outside, and not very far outside, it's really difficult to tell the difference. Even in very superficial ways from within, we can see similarities that are not particularly meaningful, but help to actually achieve affinity between the two places. In my own case, for example, I was a student at Cambridge, and now I teach at Oxford. And coincidentally, my college at Cambridge, Clare, and my college at Oxford, Brasenose, have the same color scheme. It's a nice coincidence, but it reminds me more of the similarities between the two institutions than their differences, and it affiliates me to both. It bridges any gap that might have existed in my own sense of what each institution represents. There are all kinds of other ways in which Oxford and Cambridge work together, not just in my mind or in the minds of people who know both places. A splendid example from an academic or an intellectual perspective is an extraordinary initiative called the Ganesa Archive project. There was an extraordinary discovery made in the early 20th century of a walled-up room in Cairo full of about 1,000 years' worth of paper. Bits of paper, scraps of paper, and some documents, but mainly fragments. All had been stored in this doorless, windowless room by people over about 1,000 years because those bits of paper contained the name of God upon them and could not be destroyed according to the faith of the Judaism that obtained across that long period of time. When this archive was discovered, it was too complex a challenge for any one university's faculty to study, and so it was brought to the UK and housed partly at the Bodleian in Oxford and partly at the University Library in Cambridge. And to this day, it's a joint effort bridging the scholarly gap of the management challenge of understanding that archive, studying it, digitizing it, conserving it, but also the intellectual challenge of bridging that gap across time, of 1,000 years of the history of Judaism in Cairo, that most cosmopolitan and bridging of cities, with the lives and loves and transactions of people that would otherwise never be recoverable to us. Now, it's interesting that it's the context of Judaism, and particularly medieval Judaism, that is so well reconstructed in the Ganesa Archive. Partly because Judaism itself can be said to represent a type of connection over time, not just a tribal one, but diachronically across the ages, where you can think about cultures and the ways they interacted with each other through the lens of this particular mode of understanding. There are Jewish communities in the most extraordinary places. We don't generally think of Jews in places like Kerala in the southwest of India, but there they are, and there they've been for 1,000 years. The diaspora of Judaism represents a type of bridging that's far less physical, but far more powerful and enduring than many of the more architectural monuments that the metaphor of a bridge often suggests. The survival of these modes of thought and means of transaction that is ensured by the ways in which Judaism has both spread itself and sustained itself in such a diasporic way across the world are in many ways an exemplary version of preservation of a culture and a type of very subtle leadership that is arguably far more successful than something more explicit. Anyone know where this bridge is? I'll give you a chance to guess. So where is this bridge? That's not right. Let's see if we can come up with some other answers that might be closer to the mark. If you're from the States, you might have an unfair advantage. Yes. We're getting some answers. It's definitely in our minds, but also in real life. It's not New York. It could have been. It's not Istanbul. It could have been. But it is the bridge between San Francisco and Oakland. It spans the bay, San Francisco Bay. What's interesting about this, to me, is the way it has connected not just two cities, but in a way that has brought both into much bigger life than they might have had otherwise. Not just socially, but economically. Oakland is a port city that equips San Francisco with many of the goods that it otherwise would have great difficulty accessing because the nearest other port would have to be very far away down the peninsula. But up until this bridge was built, getting all those goods from Oakland over to San Francisco was logistically exceedingly difficult. It occurred by ferries, which is another way of conveying from one place to another, but not as efficient as a bridge. The bridge, of course, has practical advantages. It's built two communities up, but it has metaphorical examples of how the vision to see the value of a bridge, the management skill to get it built, and the leadership to make sure that it continues to function to the benefit of the communities on both sides. That's a form of leadership effectiveness that, again, is highly revealing. I can see people giggling about things that I have no idea, so I'll swiftly move on to the next metaphorical dimension of bridges. Sometimes we see bridges spanning borders, and this is where the metaphor can be edgier, trickier, because at a border you often have conflict, you have dispute, and in fact you can have a battle. Possibly one of the most substantive things connected by a bridge in military history is represented in this painting of Raphael. It's a fresco, actually, representing the Emperor Constantine's victory over his rival claimant to the Empire of Rome, Maxentius. Constantine won a battle at a place called the Milvian Bridge, which you can just about see here. Doesn't look at all like that, and never did, but anyway, that's a bridge. And the representation in Constantine's political program of this victory was very much reposed on the fact that it happened at a bridge. He himself wanted to represent the bridging of an old Rome and a new Rome, and then most specifically, a pagan Rome and a Christian Rome, because he claimed to have seen a vision in the sky telling him that in the sign of the cross, he would win. So in Greek, en touto nika, or in Latin, in hoc signo vinces, both meaning in this sign you shall conquer. But that metaphor isn't maintained without reference to this conjunction of political systems, religious systems, and social systems that come to constitute late antiquity and ultimately the Europe that grew out of it. Here's Europe. What's left of it? And interestingly, what's notable about the euro note is what's on the reverse of every note. Have you noticed? Have you noticed? They're bridges. Each of the denominations, all whatever there are, 8 of them, has a bridge on the back. This is the 10-euro note, and there's a bridge on it. All of them have bridges. They all represent this idea that the European community, its economic and its political form, are meant to yoke together entities, polities, ideologies that had in the fairly recent past been polarized in an extreme way. But the European project represents itself as leading out of that chaos, leading into some sort of communality. And it's not insignificant that it's a commercial or a financial mechanism that first brings this sense of community about, that leads these warring nations together. What better motivator or interest than the financial? Interestingly, though, all of these bridges, every single one of them, is fictional. None of them exists. They're all just dreamed up by the designers who designed the currency. But even more interestingly, an artist in Holland has recreated all of them in a small village in Holland. If you go, I forget the name and I wouldn't know how to pronounce it anyway, but you can go and see these fake bridges made real in a way that's meant to acknowledge the fractures in the European project. And also the fact that it's now more than just a financial project, more than just an idea of credit or connection through transactions, and in fact, more like a social system that is, for all its complexities and difficulties, nonetheless becoming real, becoming solid, just as the fictional bridges are becoming real bridges here in a place that is visitable by all of us. Here's the one on the 10-euro note. Looks even more real because of the saltpeter coming out of the stone. And in time, we'll forget that it's an art project and only remember it as being a symbol of connection. I study this sort of thing, the metaphors that allow us to connect the commercial world and the cultural world. And one way that I do it is by looking at the heritage industry. We look at how there is actually a lot of economic advantage, economic contribution from culture. In the UK particularly, it's a big engine of economic activity, almost to the extreme of being 22 billion of the annual, or the gross value add into the economy. That's 2% of the economy, which is about the 8th largest sector of the whole economy. It's 20 billion of that is tourism. So the large majority of it is tourism, but there's other in things like heritage property development. If you build or renovate a heritage house, the value of the whole neighborhood goes up in measurable ways. And in fact, there are jobs and taxes that come from this confluence of culture and commerce that are truly not inconsiderable. The people in this industry who've seen it are leading Britain's ability to generate economic advantage from culture. One small statistic that I just love is the fact that just last year, the number of people visiting historic houses, so not even towers or castles, but just houses, so Blenheim Palace, for example, 24 million. It's larger than the number of tourists visiting Japan altogether. There's something about the demand for culture that constitutes a connection to industrial economics that's really worth studying. We're not doing enough of it, and that's the way I spend most of my time. I could think about it in a different way, a polarized way. For example, a business guru like Milton Friedman, who is famous for having said, the business of business is business. It's about profit, it's about shareholders. But on the other side, another polarity, a famous Oxford aesthetician and philosopher, Walter Pater, who famously remarked, art for art's sake. A tantalizing and gnomic remark that's meant to make you think, but also meant to make you think only that the value of art is not to be quantified, not to be considered something instrumental in the way that historic properties add economic value to a neighborhood. How do you reconcile those two? Well, it's possible. Intellectual leadership shows that there's a position in the middle. For example, another Oxford figure, William Morris, famous for his designs and also for his business acumen in the 19th century, remarked that objects in homes, i.e. really as close to us as we can get, should be both beautiful and useful, or we should consider them from either side. He's trying to think his way through this polarity to bridge the gap between them. And along the way, he made quite a lot of money, and perhaps more importantly, quite an enormous and outsized influence on British design. You will have seen his wallpapers. You'll have seen buildings influenced by his own home and sense of style. Even today, companies like Habitat are still peddling his designs. Sanderson's interior decorators, that was his company. He's everywhere, William Morris. He's particularly vivid in Oxford, though, because he built a lot and influenced a lot around here, but also because of another weird coincidence, the fact that there is another William Morris in Oxford, a businessman, possibly comparable to Henry Ford in UK terms, William Morris, Lord Nuffield, who built the factory that's now run by the BMW Group on the edges of Oxford, where the Mini is still made, and where the designs around industrial engineering were refined and made efficient under William Morris's leadership. These two men, both with the same name, both living in Oxford, it's a coincidence that someone who stops to think about it can draw a connection between them. But it's a connection that has both aesthetic and economic advantages when you stop to think about it. Both of them have made Oxford a wealthier place than it might have been otherwise, and have made Britain as a whole a more advanced and sensitive environment for all of us to live in. Which do you think is the bigger lie, either of these polarities? The business of business is business, or art for art's sake? After hearing my thoughts, I'd be curious to see whether you find it possible to polarize yourselves in this way. Clearly, there's much more subtlety to thinking about these extremes, subtlety that comes from bridging the gap between them, rather than thinking of either of them as true to the exclusion of the other. I'm pleased to see that this is a debate in graphical form. To summarize, what leaders do is build bridges. There's no good definition of leadership, but it does involve all of these verbs and nouns: connecting, affiliating, collaborating, commanding, and so on, legitimating, expressing. And that's what I hope my examples and metaphors have indicated, that thinking about leadership as an act of bridging, or thinking about bridges as acts of leadership, allows us insights into how this is not only a metaphor, but something that's real, that makes art happen, that makes wealth happen, and that makes ideas come to life in a very vivid and useful way. So let me leave you one more chance to end with your input and one more question. What does the idea of a bridge mean to all of you? While the words emerge, let me take this opportunity to thank our organizers and indeed all of you for taking 15 minutes to think about how the idea of a bridge is a wonderful example of leadership. Thank you very much.